Well, Nicola Sturgeon says she wants a seat at the Brexit negotiation table. Well, given that she wants Scotland to leave the UK and she wants Scotland to be in the EU, you have to ask which side of the negotiation table does she want to be on?
After 20 years of political isolation in Scotland, the Conservatives could be making a comeback. And while there are 700,000 Scots who voted to leave the European Union a year ago, Brexit has not been the Conservatives' biggest selling point to attract new supporters.
Well, the main issue on the doorsteps is the prospect of another referendum, and that undoubtedly is the biggest issue which is mentioned by most voters.
John Lamont is one of the Scottish Conservatives in contention. He's well known in the area. He was the local representative in Scottish Parliament for 10 years. He resigned ahead of this election, a show of confidence that he thinks he can win the Westminster seat for the Conservatives in what looks to be a tight race.
There is a trend and a mood of voters moving towards the Conservative Party because they see Ruth Davidson and Scottish Conservatives as the best and most effective way of sending a message to Nicola Sturgeon that they don't want another referendum.
The Ettrick-Roxburgh-Berwickshire constituency is a borderland with England.
Because there's a lot of English people, I think, actually live here in the borders, and then they tend to automatically vote Conservative, Tory.
David McNeil runs a general store in the area. He says the SNP are the only party fit to represent Scots because of their pro-independence agenda.
I mean, who can run this country better than ourselves? Certainly not people 400 miles away in another country, in London, who are completely out of touch with the Scottish psyche. We feel as if it's just been traded away. London couldn't care less about us because nobody in Scotland really votes Conservative.
The SNP are not Scotland. The SNP do not have a monopoly of being Scottish. I am as Scottish as anybody else, and it is a complete myth for the SNP to try and pretend that they are the only people who can stand up for Scotland at Westminster.
David says he's supporting Lamont's SNP opponent, incumbent Callum Kerr.
He is as Scottish as anybody, fair enough, but his political ideals are just completely out of kilter. Our ideals are for Scotland. His ideals are for his masters down in England, down in London. So he's a nice guy, but I mean, Callum Kerr's a nicer guy.
David is taking part in a march in Glasgow for independence, something the SNP have not been as vocal about this election.
Vote SNP on the 8th of June. To give me a mandate to demand a place for Scotland at the Brexit negotiating table so we can work to keep Scotland in the single market.
While the Conservatives have used the debate over independence to try to pick up votes, the SNP has talked more about Brexit on the campaign trail. The SNP has said that only after ink on the Brexit negotiations has dried can Scotland resume its push for independence. Asad Khan was one of the youth behind the initial push.
Over 80% of young people voted, and I was one of the 16 and 17-year-olds again that were able to vote in the referendum, so it was great, no, definitely. This election is not about independence. This election is about SNP, whether or not we want to stop the Tories.
He says the fact that the SNP are not talking about independence during this election doesn't mean there isn't hope.
Well, we can't quite come to terms with how we, as Scotland, aren't getting the government that we vote for. We saw, I think it was since 1955, Scotland has consistently voted against the Tory government, and it's been a Labour until 2015. But yet we've had Tory governments. That's just not fair.
The SNP has replaced Labour as the party representing Scots' left-leaning electorate.
I was a Labour voter for 35 years, but Labour have let Scotland down so badly. I support Jeremy Corbyn, but the leaders in Scotland are out campaigning now for the Tories to stop SNP. They should be stopping the Tories, not supporting them.
While some say that Tory gains will strike a blow against independence, it's clear here that there's still plenty of energy left in the movement. The SNP is widely expected to remain the dominant party, and while their majority may be trimmed and their agenda delayed, it's clear that many Scots will continue to push for an independent Scotland, whatever the result. Randolph Nogle, the Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now by James Dornan. He is the Scottish National Party Member of Parliament for Glasgow Cathcart. From Edinburgh, John McClellan. He is the Conservative Councillor for the City of Edinburgh and Director of the Scottish Newspapers Society. Also from Edinburgh, Eric Joyce. He is a former Labour Member of Parliament. Thanks all so much for joining us. You know, I've just cast my mind back to when Theresa May actually said she would not call a general election, only to change her mind last month and say she needs a stronger mandate to negotiate Brexit, and June 8th is the day. So I want to ask all three of you, where does that decision leave Scotland? Is a snap election good for the country? Eric Joyce, let me start with you.
Well, Theresa May has been exposed as wobbly and weak throughout this whole campaign. It's the most striking aspect of the whole general election campaign, many people think. As far as Scotland's concerned, it's really a secondary consideration of the UK government, which is entirely dominated by England. Almost every single minister is English. And Theresa May's consideration of Scotland really comes a long way down her list of priorities. So Scotland will go through with this, as we have to, but hopefully this may be for the last time.
Okay, John McClellan.
Well, I think it's an opportunity to give clarity to the whole political settlement across the whole of the UK. And I think that the Prime Minister's position has been to do what she thinks is best for the whole of the UK. And hopefully after Thursday, we'll have the clarity that the whole of the country needs, and in particular in Scotland. OK, James Dornan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's quite amusing that the one person who now wishes that there wasn't an election more than anybody else is probably Theresa May. She started off from a position where she thought she was just going to be able to have a procession until polling day, and it's not turned out like that. You can't hide from the public and then pretend that you're a strong leader, and that's what Theresa May's been doing. So this election shouldn't have been happening in the first place, happened for the wrong reasons, and now I think that she regrets calling it.
But James, I've actually heard some say that Theresa May and Brexit could actually prove the best thing to happen to the Scottish National Party.
In what way? I mean, this is Brexit. The decision to leave the European Union was the second worst political decision that I have had in my political career. Obviously, the first being the morning of the September the 19th in 2014. But it's not good for Scotland, it's not good for the rest of the UK, and it's particularly not good for Scotland if Scotland is going to have absolutely no say on what sort of deal that we're going to be left with. We need to be able to stay in the single market.
I think you misunderstood the point. Theresa May pushing for Brexit against the will of the Scottish people pushes support towards the Scottish National Party.
Well, maybe, but you know, sometimes we have to look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is that this is going to be bad for the people of Scotland. That decision that they made and the way that she's running this Brexit campaign is bad for the people of Scotland, and it's bad for the United Kingdom. It may well end up that what it does is boost their support for the independence, or it boosts their support for the SNP. But to be honest, there's a bigger picture at stake here, and the fact is it's the way that the Brexit is going to impact on the people of Scotland. OK, John, let me ask you, do you feel that Theresa May has Scotland's best interest at heart?
Well, yes, I do. I don't think there's any question of that, but she's acting as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think just to answer your previous point about whether the Brexit has been good for the SNP, I think even James would confess that actually it hasn't. It hasn't resulted in an increase in SNP support. And in fact, certainly I've picked up many people on the doorsteps who have it's caused them, SNP supporters who've been caused a significant problem about it, because they want even less to do with Brussels than they want to do with London. 400,000 SNP members, it's estimated, do not want to be part of the EU. So it's posed a significant question for the SNP in the way that they manage this process. I'm sure James knows that, because he'll have been speaking to these members too.
James, I'll let you respond.
There's also a lot of members, there's also a lot of supporters of the Union that supported Remain. So you can't have this as a one-sided thing. It's both sides of this debate that there's been a crossover.
Yeah, I agree with that, James. I was a Remain campaigner myself, so you know, I'm not saying that this is a problem that is only for the SNP, but I just think it's to challenge the point raised by the interviewer that this has been good for the SNP, because I don't think it has.
Eric, let me ask you, how many people do you think actually share your sentiment that they voted against Scottish independence only to say now, we don't want the UK, we want the EU, and if Scottish independence is the way to get back into the EU, we'll move in that direction?
A lot. John earlier referred to SNP support. There's a difference between SNP support and support for independence. What's happened in Scotland is that the Conservatives have benefited from one or two people from the SNP moving across, perhaps towards their right, moving across to the Tories, and a lot of unionists, people who want to stay part of the UK, from the Labour Party moving across, and it's left a very large chunk of the admittedly modest support in Scotland within the Labour Party now supporting independence. So to whatever vote the SNP gets, perhaps 42, 43% of the vote, you need to add an additional 7 or 8% for people in the Labour Party who would prefer independence now, because they want to stay in the EU and they completely deplore the Brexit nonsense the Prime Minister is taking us through.
Eric, let me ask you though, do you think it's likely that Scotland could declare independence from the UK and ultimately rejoin the EU if a hard Brexit goes through?
I think it's actually likely, yes. I think at the moment the split looks to be about 50-50. But in due course, we're going to see many very, very bad effects of Brexit. This is exactly what people like John argued and said in the case when he campaigned for Remain. He said it would be bad to go through Brexit, and now we're going through Brexit. In the event that Scotland does, as I hope, vote for independence, it'll be up to Scotland to have its own referendum to decide whether it wants to remain in the EU or return to the EU. And I strongly feel that they will, but it's up to Scots to make their own judgment, as it is with every other EU member. And I think they will decide to go back into the EU.
And John, let me ask you, why don't you feel Scotland can do it on its own? Why isn't self-determination really good for the Scottish people?
The UK has benefited Scotland for many, many years and will continue to do so. Scotland faces a number of challenges which it's best able to meet with the support of the rest of the UK. We know that there's a small matter of £15 billion shortfall in the taxation position in Scotland, and if everything went the SNP's way in an independent Scotland, we'd still have to find £15 billion from somewhere. That's a hell of a bill to put before the Scottish people, and there's no matter which way you cut that would mean either slashes in services or increases in taxation, and there's no way around that. That is the position that an independent Scotland would face, and that's one very good reason why I'm firmly against it. The other thing is quite simply that people like me have never felt alienated from the systems that govern the United Kingdom. We are part of the United Kingdom. We are British as well as Scottish, and we want to remain so.
Eric, let me ask you, do you feel a sense of alienation at all?
What I think is that there's a broad centre-left consensus in Scotland, and there is a very strong right-wing consensus in England. And in the end, the politics of the UK now is all about the politics of England, telling everybody else the way it's going to be. It's really the UK has become a greater England. And people in Scotland who want a decent social democracy in the context of the EU have to make a choice. They can be part of a long-term conservative greater England, or they can be a small country in the EU. And the EU seems, to many of us, by far the larger and more important historical project.
James, I'll let you comment there, because I saw you kind of raise your eyebrows as John was speaking.
Yes. The 15 billion was raised again. What John forgets to mention is that the UK has got debt of what, £1.5 trillion. Debt is as usual in a country, and debt has to be paid for. But that would be a matter that's just a matter of fact. Also, you've got to remember that this debt, Scotland is not an independent country just now, so the debt is the UK's, and this debt has been built up over the UK. It is not a Scottish debt.
John, if you want to respond quickly, go ahead, or else I'd like to wrap up with a final thought. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, what James is suggesting is that we just keep borrowing. A new country that will have no credit rating at all, borrowing at the maximum expense, so that the SNP's programme to cover our costs is just to keep on borrowing. It's a very straightforward programme for total bankruptcy of this country, and it's something which all sensible people would do
£1.5 trillion of debt sounds a wee bit like a big debt.
It will be even bigger per capita in an independent Scotland. I think that's fair.
Okay, I want to wrap up with a final issue here, because all three of you are on very different pages, and in a sense you do pretty well represent the Scottish public, which does seem politically divided now in a way it hadn't been before. Eric Joyce, let me start with you. How much stronger a position would Scotland be in if it were more politically united going into this election?
Well, it's divided because we have different opinions and we're a democracy, so you know, we have to make a judgment. But I think the simple fact is that the trajectory of history is more about the kind of society we want to live in, and not about arguing about today's deficit, yesterday's deficit, what tomorrow's deficit might be. These are economic figures that people can juggle and throw all over the place. In the end, there's a large economic project in the EU, and there is a strong cultural and economic tie between Scotland and the EU. And many of us, I think over half of us, in due course will want to be part of that, and not part of this trend towards right-wing, little Ingleter, greater Ingleter, more like the US, red in tooth and claw, extreme conservatism. We don't want part of that.
John, go ahead.
That's not, well, it's not a conservatism that I recognise, that's for sure. I think the issue as far as the UK versus the EU, again, because it comes down to brass tacks. The UK is worth 4 times more to Scotland than the EU is. So what does Scotland want to be part of a single market with the United Kingdom? Or does it want to break that?
Does everything boil down to money?
It does not, well, everything has to be paid for. You know,
sure, but you're making up a figure of 15 billion. That's a made-up figure. That's a made-up figure. It's a trope.
It's not a made-up figure. Those are from GERS. Those are from the GERS figures.
You know it's a trope.
That is not a made-up figure.
It's extracted from the UK figures.
It is from the GERS.
You know it's extracted from the UK figures, which doesn't explicitly refer to Scotland's economic output.
These are GERS figures that the Scottish Government goes along with. It's not.
And explicitly within GERS it says this is not a projection. As you know, it explicitly says in GERS that this is not
it's where we are now. It is where we are now. From
economy,
day one,
independent.
We would be starting with a 15 billion
pounds trope.
No.
Okay, James Dornan, I'll let you jump in.
No, it's not.
Yes, I was just going to leave the matter for the time being. The Scotland, Eric's quite right. It's all about the sort of country that we want, and I think that there's more and more people are want to see the difference between the European movement and what's happening down south. Scotland has always been that left of centre social democratic country in the main, and I think that that's where we would continue to want to be. And the more that they see what the UK is going to be like under a hard Brexit, the more that the people in Scotland are going to come to our project and try their hardest to distance themselves from the project that is going to be that greater England, as Eric described it, which the UK is going to become. And we're seeing it more and more. And you have to remember that we've got two Conservative leaders, Ruth Davidson and Theresa May, who both supported Remain and said that Brexit would be a disaster for us, and have suddenly changed their mind because that suits their career prospects as opposed to what's best for the country. And I think that's a pretty shameful position for them to be in.
Okay, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it there.
It suits the democratic outcome of the referendum.
I'm going to give you the last word, James, and a little bit to John there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us from Scotland on this edition of the Newsmakers.